Okay. Welcome to episode 7 of the SumerSports show. I'm Eric Eager, the VP of Research and Development at SumerSports. I'm joined by Thomas Dimitrov, the CEO of SumerSports. Thomas, we're 10 weeks in, or now we're in week 11. We're 10 weeks in to our first season as SumerSports, and obviously the 2022 NFL season. Thomas, what are your takeaways so far?
Oh man, look, I just got back from Palm Beach. That's where our head office is. With Paul Tudor Jones and Jack Jones, the co-founders. They're just so passionate about it. So every time I leave there, and you know that because we're on a ton of meetings together, whether we're virtual or not, and we're talking about everything under the sun as far as analytics, as far as making the football world better and revolutionizing. And look, prior to joining this group and being around all of you big brains, I would have probably thought, how are you really going to revolutionize? And I realize everything that we're talking about is leading in the direction of the evolution of the league and where we're going with analytics. And man, every time I get off a Zoom call, or a Teams call with everyone, it just has me back on my heels a little bit, thinking about the direction and what's going to be available to the up and coming general managers in this league in the next 3 to 5 years is going to be amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so energizing, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the stuff that we're really getting to, which I think is phenomenal, and it's so refreshing. I mean, I gotta give you a secret, Thomas. Like, my favorite time of the week is the half hour between the podcast and when we first log into this into StreamYard, because you and I are just like going through topics and all the things that we can sort of think about and notions that we can dive into that are just different than what I've been able to in the past. And by the way, we are live for the first time. Frazier in the comments there, thank you. Hello there. Well, hello to you. Thank you for joining us, Mason Dimitrov. We're really happy to have you. And again, Thomas and I are delighted that you all want to share some of your Wednesday night with us, and you're missing Maction to watch us. So we know that is deep to us here. So one of the things that we did last week that I thought was really cool was I said something that I believe, or 3 things that I believed, and like you came back at it a little bit, which I thought was really cool, and it elicited a discussion. And so I want to give you 3 things that I believe about the NFL right now, and specifically a team that is near and dear to my heart as a Minnesotan, but also a friend, of Kwesi Adolfo-Mensah, but also sort of his approach to football. I want to tell you 3 things that I believe about the Minnesota Vikings. The first one, and I think this is going to be a little bit controversial, but I think the Minnesota Vikings are built a lot like the 2021 Los Angeles Rams were built. The Los Angeles Rams, a team that I famously doubted a little bit, just because I didn't think that they necessarily had a good roster from top to bottom, did win a Super Bowl. They did so with what I call like kind of a stars and scrubs approach, right? Where they had amazing football players, Aaron Donald, Cooper Kupp, Andrew Whitworth, Jalen Ramsey, but even down the list a little bit, Leonard Floyd, Odell Beckham Jr., Von Miller ended up, he's more up that list. I look at this, and the last part is they didn't get injured a lot. And I thought that was fundamental to the Rams and Kevin O'Connell moving over. This Vikings team, obviously, Justin Jefferson is in the conversation to be the best player in the league. You have Zadarius Smith is leading the NFL in pressures. You have, Donnell Hunter, who's a good football player, Patrick Peterson, Harrison Smith, Christian Darrisaw, who by PFF standards is the highest graded left tackle in football, Dalvin Cook. And you have injuries that are among the league's lowest. So when I look at this team, there's some of those characteristics I feel like are similar about this Vikings team and last year's Rams team. What do you think?
Wow. I mean, so much there. I think it's a really, really good thought and analogy. And yet I was trying to be, as I was thinking about the topic, I was trying to figure out where my sort of critical bent was and what I was feeling inside. And I was honestly putting myself back to, first of all, taking the job in 2008 with the Falcons, right? You're a first-time general manager, like Kwesi Adolfo-Mensah is. Now, I had been around football all my life, and Kwesi's background was much more basketball, of course, and analytics. Really, really smart person, of course. But I put myself in that spot again, and I was thinking, I never once thought about there were some rumblings out there that prior to the season, people would say to me, Thomas, do not come out of the gate as strong as you need to, because the expectations for Arthur Blank are going to be out of this world. And in year 2, if you come back flailing a little bit, you'll have no leeway and expectations will be way too high. I'm going to tell you right now, categorically, none of us ever think about that. Man, it is a not for long league, and we need to get out of the gate strong. We will take our wins. We will take our special rosters, whatever we can, anytime we can, quite honestly. Now, that doesn't mean we're not visionary, Eric. So I just want to make sure we get that out there. The next thing is, you're talking about this. I think there are some really good parallels to the Rams, Vikings thing, from last year to this year. The only thing I would say to you that I feel a little bit differently about than you maybe is, I don't see the star factor as much on the Vikings group, right? With the Vikings group, I see a lot of good players. I see a good midline quarterback. I see Jefferson, of course, who is top notch as a receiver. I love their move bringing in the new tight end. I mean, to me, that was a classic, first year general manager move that's going to get a massive, in my mind, check. I love the way Hockenstein plays.
Mm-hmm.
Am I pronouncing that right?
Yeah, I think it's
Hockenson, excuse me. I love the way he plays. I've always liked the way he moved around with Detroit coming in there. So I think there are some good football players, but I don't see the greatness and the eliteness that I saw in Los Angeles last year. And I will say, last thing, folding in my time in New England, we had a lot of good players over those years. When we went on our run, we didn't have a lot of great players necessarily. We had one for sure, but we had a lot of good players like Bruschi and Vrabel and Troy Brown, and across the board, they all played together. What Kevin O'Connell is doing this year, along with Kwesi, I think they take a good roster and they make it as good as they can, and they capitalize. And I think that's what they're doing right now.
Yeah, I think the big thing that you're pointing out, which I think is true, is that Sean McVay is a Hall of Fame coach. I think he's already established that. Raheem Morris is a very good defensive play caller, and they did a lot of cool stuff there. But the Rams stars played to expectation. I think Ramsey played to expectation. Kupp played above expectation. You had 2,000 yards. The Vikings, their what I call stars, are playing higher than expectation. You can't expect a guy like Patrick Peterson at 33 to get the number of interceptions that he's getting. Zadarius Smith missed most of last year, and Donnell Hunter's missed most of the last 2 years. They're playing above expectation. And Christian Darrisaw is a second-year left tackle, and he's playing like Andrew Whitworth. You expect him to be a rock. Christian Darrisaw, you're doing better than expectation with him being amazing at left tackle. So I think to your point, it is more Patriots-like in that head coach, that coordinator, they're getting a fair amount out of this team, more than you would expect, right? And that was characteristic of those first 3 Super Bowls where, Troy Brown was playing nickel corner for you guys, right? And Mike Vrabel was, getting, double-digit sacks, and you had guys like, Wilfork and Warren and guys like that who were just playing above their skis. And that, of course, drove you guys to Super Bowl. So I do like that. Here's the other part, and I think this will get back to the thing that you just pointed out, which is the other part of this evaluation for me is the position the Vikings are in the future. Because, and I think Kwesi will tell you this, like, they had some work to do when he took over. Spielman, made a great draft pick in Darrisaw, and he made a bunch of good moves, but the salary cap for them wasn't in a great spot. So he had to kind of smooth things out. They had to give Cousins the 1-year extension and the void year. They had to give Thielen and all those guys, deals. And next year is not going to be pretty for them. I don't think that they can necessarily add to this roster. So it makes it kind of a win now thing. And fortunately for Les Snead and McVay and Stafford, they won their Super Bowl last year, because this year it's not quite as good. Can you expound? Like, that is a tough situation to be in, where you find yourself, and this is, as somebody who's followed the Vikings my whole life, this is how it always is for the Vikings. They get a pop-up year, and they have to win that year, or else it's not as easy after that.
Well, look, I'm following you, and I'm thinking, man, I want to put your mind at ease as a Minnesotan for a minute. Everything is so valid. Everything that you're saying is so valid, and yet I keep coming back to Kwesi and Kevin as team builders. And I know that they're not pulling their hair out thinking about next year per all the bad, tough moves we're going to have to make. This goes back to the fact that, again, they have good players. They don't have all of these stars that they're thinking, oh my God, we won't even be able to function. They're going to go in, and I guarantee you right now, Eric, they're looking at that roster, whether their team wants to know about it or not. They're looking at the roster, and Kwesi has to be thinking about putting a little bit of an asterisk beside a couple of these guys here and there, or a highlight mark where it may be, let's keep an eye on this guy. We can potentially replace, because the draft is strong in certain areas, and we can be that much more, we can bring our cap out of that. What are they at? 4.9 right now, at least projected on over the cap as far as, for next year. Obviously they have a lot of work to do, but knowing the draft a little bit, knowing where they can make moves, knowing that what you and I might look at is vital to the success of their team, they may be seeing the downside of some of these players that everyone else is seeing as a shiny, whatever you call it, piece of jewelry.
Yeah, like a shiny asset. Where they see Adam Thielen, like the world sees Adam Thielen a little differently than everybody's been around him, who sees him as he's a Ring of Honor Viking, but he's he's on the downturns of his career a little bit. I feel like, and maybe you can expound on this because you did take over a team that had talent, not great talent, but you took over a team that was at least good enough after you made your moves to go 11-5 in year one. Was it easier for you to look more soberly at players that somebody else drafted after you take over a team? I think that is maybe where Kwesi can offer a little pragmatism that maybe Vikings fans who are kind of in their feels about players may not be able to. Very,
very, very astute question. No question about that from my perspective. We came in, we made a lot of moves prior, to kicking off that 2008 season, myself and Mike Smith. I mean, D'Angelo Hall, the first move we made was trading him to the Raiders. And by the way, when we traded him to the Raiders, I remember getting a call from Al Davis. And we all know, those of us who follow football, Al Davis, the very first move I ever made as a GM. Think about this. I'm dealing with Al Davis. I mean, if anyone has any parallels to that, like it is. So he calls me up 2 weeks later and he's like, I want my effing pick back. And I'm like, you can't do that.
Because and you'll know this about me, my memory. I remember opening night, Monday Night Football 2008, poor D'Angelo Hall in a Raiders uniform was absolutely abused by Jay Cutler, Eddie Royal, and the Denver Broncos. And good on him. He made a career after that, but he lasted 8 games in Oakland. Like that was a crazy, right. Crazy trade.
Eric, you're exactly right. Yeah. I'm sorry to interrupt you. I'm only excited about it because when it went down, it was very acrimonious, me dealing with D'Angelo. I was literally walking down the middle of the Combine streets. It was slushy, horrible. He was on the phone with me and he was agitated with me, of course, because he didn't want to leave. That's his world. He's a very talented player, but it was just one of those things that we were making moves because they weren't our guys. We moved on from a number of players that, Keith Brooking, for instance. Keith was a really good football player and a long-time player there. We were making moves over year one and year two that weren't easy to make, but they were easier to make when you didn't bring them in. So back to Kwesi, you're exactly right. Kwesi and Kevin, the way they're going to build this, the way that they see it playing out going into this year, let's go with these guys and let's have our eye closely focused on some of these players that we know more than likely we're going to move on from, and we're going to hopefully find them in the draft, hopefully in free agency. But believe me, Kwesi's mind, very smart mind, is already thinking about in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I guess the third thing that I think is, so the first thing I think is that they're similar to the Rams. I think you're right, though. There is a gap between the two, but a gap maybe that can be covered up by good coaching, even though the Rams had great coaching too. But I think secondly is they're not in a great position after this year. I do think it's limited though. And I think in 24, they're going to have a fairly solid chance to do things again. So all in all, and again, this is when you look at the history of the Vikings, at least in my lifetime, 1998, it was Randall Cunningham, right? That was his last hurrah. In 2000, it was Dante Culpepper. That was like the Dennis Green's last hurrah. He was fired a year later. 2009 was the one good Brett Favre year that was left, right? And then in 2017, it was the one Case Keenum year, right? And so I feel like with Cousins, this could be Cousins' last chance to win something meaningful for the Vikings because of age. You've already seen his statistics decline, but also just like his contract and that kind of thing. In Vikings history, it's always been you lose in the NFC title game, you kind of buy right back into what got you there, which was kind of lucky / unsustainable, and then it hurts your franchise for another few years. What I think is you got to win it this year, because if you don't, it's just going to cause, I think, a difficult set of decisions for next year and the year after. But to your point, I think Kwesi and Kevin O'Connell are very much, equipped to make those tough choices.
Well, you're looking at it from, you have to win from your standpoint. You've been following this team for a long time. As I look at it from a former executive in the league, I'm thinking you don't have to win it. I mean, there's no massive pressure. It's great what they're doing. 8-1. I mean, that's a really impressive place to be. You contrast to, I know you're in the process of writing a pretty cool article on the Bears. I mean, reading some of the beginning points on that, you're right on the dial on that as well. But we have a GM there, Ryan Poles, who's in a completely different situation as far as the record, right? Ryan Poles right now, no disrespect, is not going to be up for, what we all talk about, as much as we don't admit to talking about it, is not going to be up for an Executive of the Year award this year. He's just not. A guy like Kwesi Adolfo-Mensah might be, but they might also look at it as like, well, he had a team that Rick Spielman had pretty much in place, and you can argue it the way you want to argue it, Eric. Zimmer is a good football coach. Things just got away from him there. Of course, he had to make a change. So there are so many ups and downs to all this, which is going to be really interesting to see. Suffice it to say, I don't think they need to win this year. I think they need to show consistency and not take this year. Next year, they lose some players. They try to fit their own people in. And then all of a sudden, they're on the lower half of 500. Then their eyes are like, wow, they don't have the same team. Now what?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think one of the reasons, the Vikings job might not have been as attractive to Ryan Poles was the fact that you had to do some of this competitive rebuild. And what I think the intellectual challenge was for Adolfo-Mensah was having to do that, because I think in some ways it's cleaner to just go with a clean slate the way that Poles has. But I also think that I think the challenge is also extremely complicated for the Vikings, and so far they've done a good job. By the way, what I love about going live is we get these comments to the right here. Thomas Frazier Lamont says the 2017 Minnesota Vikings are better than the 2022. Thielen was on both teams. Thielen was younger and better back then. Donnell Hunter was on both teams. He's younger and better than back then. I also think I do agree with that statement, but at the same time, I also think the league was better in 2017. It was, as a member of a team that made the playoffs last year, Thomas. Like, the league in 2017, I think, was a little stronger than the league this year, which is one more point to my Rams point, which was the thing I think I missed about the Rams last year was they identified a league that was not top heavy. And so when they went all in, they were one of the few teams that was able to capitalize on weaker seasons from Kansas City, weaker seasons from the top of the NFC, namely Tampa Bay being injured and so on. Like, they were right there to take advantage of it. The Minnesota Vikings, if you think about it, they faced a backup quarterback or an injured quarterback in more than half their games this year. That there's a little bit of something to that as well. So, anyway, and there's some good questions here, in the chat. We'll certainly get to those at the end. One thing I wanted to talk.
Can I comment on 17 quickly? Your Vikings in 17, because I had this conversation with Howie Roseman, who's a good friend of mine. Because I still think about coming off of 16, getting our asses kicked, historic loss. 17, we're making a run. We're two games into the playoffs, right? Playing Philly. By the way, unfortunately, we do those. We're throwing those fade, but don't even get me started on that. We piss down our leg there and we don't get by. Unfortunately, Philly goes on, of course, and they go up to Minnesota, and Minnesota was just a completely different team, right? Philly goes to the Super Bowl, they win, all things in line, right? You and I know this. It is not, there is luck in the league, meaning the ball has to literally and figuratively bounce your way to be a championship team. Any team we ever won in New England that I was with, we had those fortunate situations. Along with, if I could bring it all the way around in the end, and again, I apologize for interjecting over you, but the idea of injury, and this is worth a whole other topic, a full show. You keep your players on the field. We'll talk about athletic performance, believe me, another time. But the teams that have a really good grasp on that have a great chance of winning, and at a lot of levels. And I believe that with the Buffalo Bills, man, they have a really, really sound setup, and I believe Philadelphia does right now with their sports performance, which is another topic.
Yeah, we have to get your friend Les Snead on so that he can tell us how the Rams have cracked the code over the past 10 years or so, where I believe 8 of those years, the Rams have been in the top 10 in the NFL in terms of injury avoidance. Maybe he'll give us the secrets. Who knows? Probably not. But I will say, back to that 17 Vikings, that 17 Vikings was first in the NFL in DVOA defensively, Football Outsiders metric. They had the same 11 starters on their defense in week 1 as they did in the NFC Championship game. That's how it goes. And you've seen both sides of it, right? You're good. The Falcons teams that went deep in the playoffs, you were healthy. Your teams later on were injured, right? And if you use a first round pick on Keanu Neal and he can't stay healthy, that's how the dice rolls a little bit sometimes. So you're absolutely right. You need luck to win in this league. By the way, Dean and Nick, we will get to your questions at the end. So please hang on with us. We're going to talk. One thing I wanted to talk about, and we brought this up at the break, because I really want to talk about this idea of, trying to measure player performance as robustly as possible. So Patrick Peterson was one guy that came up, and I don't have the PFF grades in front of me, but like Patrick Peterson has graded really well by PFF this year, better than Jalen Ramsey. And that was sort of like the sort of crossover where you're like, well, I think the stars for the Rams are a little better than the stars for the Vikings. And I think everybody would say, even if you took age out of it, people would still trade more for Jalen Ramsey than they would trade for Patrick Peterson. And so the question is like, what is PFF missing? And as somebody who worked there, now I don't grade the players, but I do, obviously build the models, and my job was to get it right, whether that be betting or fantasy or whatever. I think it's instructive to talk about kind of what you have to do as an analyst or as an evaluator to get the best projection possible. And I'm going to talk about it from an analytics standpoint. I know, though, from a scouting standpoint, like, you have a number of tools in the tool set where you're looking at, okay, I can look at his character, I can look at his burst, I can look at, talking to his coaches. Like, there's so many ways. And I thought, the interesting part when I was at Pro Football Focus was, we had one product, which was the grades and the data. And ultimately, there was a conflict at times between selling that product, and because that product is what it was going to be and it was designed the way it was supposed to be, and getting the right answer about players. And I think that at some positions, it's instructive to sort of think about, what kind of different data sources you need to get your hands on to get the best eval on a player.
Oh, let me start by saying, there were many times we had so much data available to us. I was thinking the last 2 or 3 years, right? What is now in front of most general managers and head coaches is unbelievable, comparatively speaking, to even the middle of the 215 or 212 or whatever it was. It's amazing, back to the evolution of the league. I would say, just from my perspective as a former team builder, I want as much information in front of me as possible. I have my go-tos, Eric, right? Of course I have my go-tos by position. There are certain things that I will be very honed in on, and other things I might cash or push aside or cash out on. Can I just add this little funny tidbit, though? I think it's
Sure.
interesting, because we had talked forever about this, and continue to ask me the questions about it. PFF is interesting that way, and as successful as you guys were, when PFF rated a team builder or a GM's team a certain way and it worked in their favor, they're all raising the roof, man. AJ Terrell, I'm gone now, but when I saw last year that AJ Terrell was the best in the world, and I had people texting me because PFF had graded him. We had to talk about that a little bit earlier.
Yeah.
But he was unbelievably, it was just what a great pick. Yeah, okay, I appreciate it, and I really like him. But the times when our O-line was just skewered by you at PFF, I'd be thinking, I don't pay any attention to that. So it's kind of which side of the fence are you on with it, right? When data works in your favor, you utilize it, right? As a GM, you utilize it showing your head coach. You utilize it with your owner who has questions, and you're able to say, look at this, Arthur Blank, A, B, and C, and X, Y, and Z, not only on, box score data or statistics, but on advanced analytics that Eric Eager from PFF is coming up with. That goes a long way if you utilize it properly.
No, and it's so right. And there's, I think you said something so cogent there, which was it's different for different positions. So like I will go to my grave basically saying the offensive and defensive line stuff for PFF is wonderful. Like they do a really good job of, the one-on-one matchups, especially in the passing game, but also in the run game. And I think it's just, and wide receiver, I think they do a really good job on those. And I think they've and to their credit, they went and collected new data. I had 3 interns this summer before I joined Sumer working on all blocking and all coverage. And so they're going after new insights, which I thought was fantastic. But when it came to corner, when their system was very targeted towards just targeted plays. And so obviously if you are targeted, that means, much like in soccer, if you have to get a slide tackle, that means you were out of position in the first place. So there is some signal there, but it just, if you're Patrick Peterson, you get 2 interceptions on Sunday, you're going to get the highest PFF grade ever. And it's there are some play Nnamdi Asomugha would go years without an interception, and he was one of the best players in the whole game. And so one of the things that I wanted to look at when I was there, and we'll continue it here, is I looked at scouts' notes, right? I literally went through, and it's Dane Brugler from The Athletic, but we had collected a bunch other, and literally doing, text analytics and looking at the words inside of scouts' notes and trying to uncover different, similarities and differences between what people were writing for different players. So when Justin Fields came along, and Justin Fields is, the topic, I think we're going to have one of our first articles on SumerSports out. Justin Fields was one of the most accurate quarterbacks in the history of PFF college data. But what I was seeing in the betting markets and what I was seeing when I would talk to people within the league was I had a friend who had a 3rd round grade on him. And that's okay, by the way. That's okay. The evaluations are what they are. When I went and did the text analytics data, the text analytics gave him a 3rd round grade, meaning and so, when folks were looking, they thought he was going to be the 3rd pick to the Niners. They thought he was going to be the 8th pick to Carolina, or the 9th pick to Denver. He ends up 11th pick to Chicago, and he struggles early on. And you're starting to think, okay, well, the data that we collected about him at PFF, the play-by-play, the grading, the charting, all that stuff was somehow missing something that a scout who, and maybe it's just a one-off thing, it could just be noise, but a scout was what could intuitively see and sort of interact with, that was similar to something they had saw in a quarterback who had struggled similarly in his career.
Well, look, I mean, we would look at all of our players, especially quarterbacks, right, Eric? And you know this, but for the listeners, there were so many levels to how we were evaluating. Of course, we take all of the information that you're talking about, all of our scouts' grades, our personnel directors' grades, our assistant GMs, our coaching grades, right? Once the coaches, by the way, finished their season, they jumped right into free agency and grading the players in the draft, the upcoming draft, that were in their position group. So there was a lot of information coming in. But one thing, or a couple of things that I'm bullish on, and most are, we could go and sell SumerSports to every team in this league, which hopefully we do. We have grandiose visions of doing something very special, and we'll talk a little bit about that more as we talk about coaching, right? But one of the things that we always say, at least in football and as team builders, you say, yeah, but what about the character? Yeah, but what about the psych ed side, evaluation side of all this? Where are we going with the true intelligence of this player, et cetera, et cetera? The things that were really, at least in our mind, tough to evaluate. I would ask you, as a data scientist and a PhD in mathematics, how do you account for that when when an executive is going to come to you, a buddy that you have, or someone that respects you, Kwesi respects you, and he's going to ask you, yeah, but how do your models account for these special elements? Because quite honestly, when you look at Atlanta Falcons, they pass up an opportunity. Yes, they still had Matt Ryan, but that group knew where Matt Ryan was, where he was. He was still good. He could still win games, but they also had to plan for the future. They passed up Fields, took one of the best tight ends to come along, pure athletes, pure athletic ability. Nothing against him or the pick. I'm just saying, by the way, obviously they're not using him. They're taking a lot of heat here in Atlanta by not using Pitts as much, but they passed up a quarterback that could be an heir apparent, could be very different. Who knows? For a tight end, a whole other topic, right? How high do you go with certain positions? But they did for a reason. I guarantee there were a reason. How far back would they have gone to get Fields? Who knows? The fact that they passed up 4th overall pick, right? To take the heir apparent, there was something there that didn't show up in the models that you were creating.
Yeah, and I think part of it. So, like, there's a good question here from Ashley is in the chat too of like, well, how do you know which stats to look at? And I think like the big thing is you have to collect a big set of data and be able to see what's predictive. And there are certain parts of the data sets that simply like. So, for example, for quarterback play, like how good a quarterback is when he's under pressure is not as predictive as how good he is when he's clean. So, like, I watched that title game where Justin Fields stood in there with broken ribs against Clemson and hits Chris Olave on the post. And I'm like, that's an amazing football play. But if the pressure comes a quarter of a second earlier, like that's not a touchdown. And maybe Ohio State doesn't run away with that game. And yet all of the narratives that we have about that guy are changed, right? And so you have to like guard against that, right? And again, the way you look at it is you take a set of data and you subset it, and then you look, okay, how does that predict what I care about in the future? So something like expected points added, or something like completion percentage above expected, something that you care about, right? Something that you care about. And that, by the way, there was a really good question in here about by Dean, who says, or Nick, who just left the chat, and said, how much does Moneyball get stifled in a cap, and how can Moneyball, will Moneyball ever get to a point in the NFL where it's so universally adopted that it's not fun anymore, like in baseball? And this is where I'll say no. I think that teams are so different schematically that you're all chasing. The game is so non-stationary that what is optimal at a given point in time will always change. And so that is part of your data too, is like find what your objective is, right? And that objective is different, as you said, for Ryan Poles as it is for Kwesi Adofo-Mensah in year one, and find the data that predicts success in that environment the best, right? And so, it could be for the Falcons, like you wanted a guy like Justin Fields to sit for a year because of Matt Ryan's cap hit and the fact that he was going to be on the team no matter what, right? And you saw maybe, and again, I'm not casting this version on that. I think Justin Fields, from all indications, is a wonderful human being, but like he had trouble sitting when he was at Georgia, right? And he transferred, right? So you don't know necessarily. And again, I'm just guessing, but there might be things that are so, beyond what we're trying to capture that is hidden in what these scouts know. And my big thing, and like, if, as I pitch Sumer to people, my thing is look, all of the information that you gather is valuable. It's our job to extract the maximum amount of value out of it. That's what data science's job is to do. And like, and to your point, there are just things that traditional data collection methods are not collecting.
Where my fascination was, in those last 2 or 3 years, as I really started honing in, and we had people in the Falcons organization who were really growing in that field, and data scientists, that I had a great deal of respect for and what we were doing. And I was so hungry and yearning for information to supplement what I already believed humbly was my art and I hate to say my genius, but I say it not as a genius, but as someone like
Thomas. You were one of 32 men at one time to be NFL general managers. It's okay to be like, it's okay to say that.
But you know what I'm saying? Like, yeah. You feel very comfortable. It's why we say, just to come back to Sumer for a minute, by developing what we're developing, you can take the good football team builders and evaluators and supplement and augment. We've said that a number of times with not only our roster optimization tool, of course, but a lot of what we're putting into our algorithms. And it really, I truly believe from the bottom of my heart, it's going to make that good GM the very good GM and potentially a Hall of Fame GM, because the more that these GMs are open to understand, if they have a good eye and they understand the elements of building a team, and they're open-minded enough to take those really vital analytics and not just the base analytics, but to your point, the advanced analytics that I could come knocking on my door. Again, I say this humbly enough or whatever it is. If you were to be my assistant GM in another world and I came to you, I'm like, I have all of my scouting reports here. I want your approach, your model approach to tell me who are truly the top 5 corners or the top 5 centers in this draft. That's where I would love to go. This league, last point, and we will talk about it many times over in these pods, this is a juxtapositioning league. We are always comparing. And the more we can compare with the more data, to the question by one of the listeners, it's figuring out what you can truly use, getting people like yourself that's going to help that general manager understand what to use and potentially what to jettison, because there's, you can only do so much. Then I think you have a fighting chance to be special, and you can prove that to your owner and hopefully parlay that into a number of contracts.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the biggest thing, by the way, is it has to be a team in every sense of the word, right? So like and one of the things I'm really truly impressed with when I talk to my friends in the league who are analytics people in the league, it is that we part. And coming at it from an outsider. Look, I work full-time PFF 2018 to 2022. Prior to that, I was a consultant. I've never worked for a team. I've worked with teams as part of my contract with PFF. The one thing that I changed my worldview so immensely after, reading Moneyball, watching Money, all that stuff. I always thought that there was a conflict. And one thing that I always found so refreshing about the good actors in the league, from my perspective, was it was all about we, right? And there was not the thing about this that's going to make it work is going to be people who are like, look, if it's my principal component that is the reason this guy's drafted, wonderful, that's amazing. But if it's Thomas's, or if it's the director of player personnel or whatever, that's great too. We're all a team, and there's got to be, and there is, I think in a lot of cases, especially with the good actors, I think that there's got to be that kind of that there has to be that team element of like, whoever's opinion it is, it doesn't matter, we're a team type of thing. And I to me, I think that that's one refreshing thing about football, is it is truly a team game. And I think we exude that at Sumer as well with a lot of our discussions. It's sort of like a very linear, thing in terms of whose ideas get used and things like that. So a very fun discussion topic. It does lead me into, by the way, this next one, because we have to talk about it. We talked about the Colts all throughout this podcast because they've been an interesting one. They win this week in Las Vegas against Josh McDaniels and the Vegas Raiders. Question I have about Jeff Saturday, not him specifically, but in general, like, is there something to this idea of a coach being able to sort of rally the troops, kind of stay away from the play calling, stay away from the minutia, and be able to rally players? Or is it just noise? Is this just, look, the Raiders are struggling. They haven't had the greatest year in the world. The Colts have talent. That's why they were favored to win the AFC South at the beginning of the year, and things just came together in a win. Or is there something more fundamental to take from Sunday?
Well, I mean, I want us to be free of the diatribes that I'm sure we could, riff on here, as far as, maybe, what Bill Cowher was talking about on live television, and Joe Thomas. I mean, they were strong. They were coming after not Jeff Saturday, the person or the leader. I mean, obviously, there's no question about that. Everyone understands that. It's something that, ownership decided to take on, as you can imagine. I'm not going to in any way speak for Chris Ballard as the general manager for the Colts, But that is a really, really multi-layered, I use that, complicated, obfuscated situation to be in as a general manager. You have to keep morale up. You have to keep the coaches, because I guarantee there is a lot of pissing and moaning around that building about what happened. I mean, any of the people out there that are defending the Jeff Saturday move, Jeff is a good guy. We all, I mean, everyone's cheering for Jeff as a person. Everyone's always liked Jeff. But as it starts really narrowing down to the profession and Bill Cowher's passionate approach to that, I get that, right? I grew up a coach's son, right? All my life, my dad was a coach until he got into scouting. They put outrageous amounts of work into it. Not saying that Jeff Saturday wouldn't. Jeff Saturday would, if possible, if he ever had the opportunity to. Right now, the most important thing for that organization is to accept who's at the helm right now. He, quite honestly, accept who's there. All those really smart football men in there, whether they were going to get head jobs or not. I'm talking about John Fox and Gus Bradley. Those guys are damn good coaches. There's a good coaching staff there with a lot of good football people. He needs to navigate that properly. Everyone needs to put that aside. Matt Ryan even needs to. Matt answered like Matt normally would. Very happy. Loved the way that Jeff Saturday approached everything. But man, it is a hot topic when you get off the mic sometimes. I've had calls from all over, and there are some pissed off personnel people. There are pissed off coaches, former coaches. And one of the reasons why there's reasons why, because it is almost heresy, of course, as Bill Cowher had talked about. But there's another side of the fear. What if owners look at this and start saying, maybe I don't need to go the traditional way, and I can get a former player who everyone respects, who turns it over to the coordinators and the position coaches, or even on the other side, the general managers who are worried about it. What if I start filling, they start filling those GM roles with more John Lynch's, more John Elway's, and they may not be.
I mean, Mike Mayock, who is a very good evaluator, but somebody who didn't have the experience. I mean,
that's right.
I think there's a really good question by Jordan Gibson in the chat that says, would you say, generally speaking, that most teams and coaches are open to accepting analytics, or there's some pushback? I think a lot of the pushback to analytics is a very similar thing where you have guys like me who I was a college math professor. I mean, I love football, and I think hopefully you guys, I love football. I know football, but I'm a math professor, and I haven't ground. I wasn't making $15,000 a year for an NFL team 25 years ago. There's a succession plan here. There's a process, right? And there are people you get in and you work tirelessly for decades to get your chance. And a lot of people who have followed that path and have worked their asses off diligently and have done all the right things, when somebody jumps the line, I think people get angry. And I think that's a natural thing for people to get angry. And I think, and if you come at it, I think people are always a little worried where if somebody comes at it and doesn't come from the inside, there's a little bit of consternation and a little bit of pushback, right?
Oh yeah. There is. And I would say in the end, again, respectfully to the people and the men who own our league and run our league, I'm talking at the very top. I'm talking about the owners. There is a responsibility for them to make sure they are delivering the message in the right way, i.e., after a hire like this, be able to come to the presser prepared enough to deliver succinctly, in my opinion. But I'm not Jim Irsay. I get it, but there's a responsibility to set the tone for the organization. Your general manager, for sure, having understanding being a general manager. I could say that too across the board. I mean, whenever there's a hot seat situation, I really believe it's the responsibility, respectfully, of the main man in charge, the owner, to assuage the concerns in an appropriate way so that the building is not a topsy-turvy cluster F, right? Mm-hmm. Because in time, it'll all play out. But that is their responsibility. Some may say, I don't really give a crap about that. I'm saying some owners I'll do it the way I want to do it. And you're right. It is their train set. We say that time and again. But if you're looking to keep your organization running in the right direction, there needs to me, there needs to be a really strong, compartmentalized, just well thought out approach when you're making, especially sort of off the beaten path moves like this. I think it's vital.
Well, and that's why I think the answer to, are there going to be more Jeff Saturdays, I think, and again, this is where Jeff Saturday has to prove everybody wrong, because I think there are guys like Mike Tomlin, for example, who he played at William and Mary with Darren Sharper, his free safety that he coached in Minnesota when he was a 30-year-old defensive coordinator. And then he's the head coach of the Pittsburgh Steelers a year later, right? Like, he jumped the line a little bit. Now, he played football, but he can coach and he can manage a team, and he can, and I think obviously the reason you were a successful GM was because you watched how it was done in a few different organizations, and you picked and choose between how you were going to run your team and how you were going to manage people and like all that stuff. And, at first, everybody likes the substitute teacher, right? Everybody likes the whole stay out of my way and all this kind of stuff. And you have a guy like Gus Bradley, who was a head coach and has been a good coordinator in this league. And you have, folks who are, on different spectrums of it. But like, you also have the 93 Oilers, where Jack Pardee was like a really nice guy that everybody liked. And he got run over by Buddy Ryan, the late, great Buddy Ryan, and Kevin Gilbride, who had a fist fight on the sideline, and Jack Pardee was a good coach. I mean, he was the one that had the 32-point lead against Buffalo. But there's a part of management that has, and I think that if a coach is going to go through and be that person that goes through the unconventional means of getting that job, he or she has to be able to manage a NFL team. And that, to me, is a non-trivial skill set. And that is one that will be revealed if it's not there.
That's a great point. The idea in our league, NFL, and it's not just Belichickian, right? The distraction averse side of most team builders, I'm talking about general managers and head coaches, is I pray to God going into any season as a team builder that there's not a cluster going on here, right? I ask everyone to truly put Chris Ballard's hat on for a minute, because it has so much nuance to it, right? Not only is Chris Ballard dealing with the media perception, right? He has to be on board with it, at least publicly,
yep.
Right? But think about the pressure that's on your general manager, who is supposed to be running your team. Yes, he's supposed to be able to take the kicks in the knees and deal with it. And he is a resilient person, along with the fact that I think he's a very good football person. We've talked about that. That's not what it's about here. That said, the distractions that are now within that organization for a general manager like that, not only about the players and how it's perceived, it's now who has the power, what is the situation, even though, Chris is in charge there. He has 53. He is the dude in charge. I've been around that. When there's a change, there's a lot of discussion and a lot of mixed messaging, not only amongst your players, amongst the management levels. God, I really like T, but Dan Quinn's coming in. Who are we siding with? It creates a really interesting level of managing that. Now think about that mid-season. Dan and I did that whole switch when Mike Smith got let go. We had the off season to work on it. Right in the middle of all this, Chris Ballard has to manage all that, continue to focus on the team. And oh, by the way, the last thing, Eric, I don't want to get away from this. He has a really tough job with all of those coaches on his staff, where there's the discussion that there may be mutiny in the ranks, and he has to manage that while still ostensibly supporting Jeff Saturday. But the guys he's been shoulder to shoulder with, I mean, how do you approach that? As a good leader, you have to walk with your head up. That's tough.
I mean, the thing, and we've all been part of organizations, right? Like the hard part is, and this was the same, whether I was a professor or at PFF, and like, you have to, I call it disagree and commit, right? Mm-hmm. There are parts of life where you don't get your way. And if you're going to be part of a team, you have to disagree and commit or leave, but you're not leaving. Like, we talked about this last week, like general manager, like guys get one or two jobs, head coach, those guys get multiple jobs, right? You're more of a you're kind of on ownership level if you're a GM versus like on the head coach, they're kind of more the employee. And like, so there's and the disagree and commit is not as easy as people believe, right? Like the thing that I've, I one of the first things I ever did with PFF was I helped a team with a report. And at the end, the guy was like, hey, I really like your podcast. I said, really? Because all I do is I say some things about your team sometimes. Like, look, he's like, not everybody in this building agrees with everything we're doing. And so, and that's a tough thing, right? Because you get in a realm of you want to root for your prediction, which is like, this isn't going to work. But you want to be a part of a team where the thing that you didn't agree with works. And that's a really hard thing. And it takes a lot of, and it's why I have immense respect for people that work. Like I have immense respect for what's going on in the people left in Indianapolis, because there's probably people who don't agree with what they're doing, but they still want to win. And that's a tough place to put your headspace in.
As a again, mathematician by trade, data scientist with football understanding and playability, I don't care whether it was, Division III, it doesn't matter. You understand football, you played football as well. When you start thinking about this Jeff Saturday situation, and then you step back and you project, you take SumerSports and all we're doing with our algorithms, which can apply to coaching as well, right? We talked about that extensively. This isn't just coming up in this pod, of course. Do you think that where you are, you could be very helpful with that big picture, of a search situation in the NFL from a data scientist standpoint first?
Fraser puts a really good question in the chat, which is, how do you evaluate coaching? And I think, one of the ways to do that is that, well, first you have to be able to evaluate players, because you have to know how good the group of players that a coach is working with are. Now, there's a little bit of the difficulty there, because everybody knows that good coaches make players better, but it's an easier time of it to call offensive plays for Tom Brady than it is for Brian Hoyer. Like, that's just a fact, right? So you have to basically, let's say, like, okay, adjusting for talent, adjusting for situation, adjusting for difficulty. How well does a coach do? And, we have great minds here, Sean Clement, Paul Sabin. Back when I was at PFF, it was myself and Tage Seth and other people were doing this work where it was like, how good is this team? Okay, let's say, okay, this is the expected outcome for this team. Okay, how do they do be above and beyond that, right? And there's even simple ways like the betting market. Like last year, Andy Reid, it was the first time in his Kansas City Chiefs tenure that the Chiefs went under their market win total, meaning the market sets a number, people bet both sides, and Andy Reid goes over every year, right? He's probably going to go over again this year. So that's like a simple way of doing it. Another way, of course, is to look at the decisions that a coach is making. And this is where I get, we talk about Frank Reich, is like, you can look at fourth down decisions. You can look at 2-point conversion decisions. You can look at timeouts. Like how many timeouts is this coach taking above and beyond what you would expect early in the game? The cool thing about Jeff Saturday was he didn't burn any timeouts last week. Like he had all of his timeouts. So when it was time to come back from a 5-point deficit at the end of the game, well, he had all of his tools in the toolbox. That's a good sign, right? And that's the work of John Park and George Lee and all of his analytics guys, but also good on him for holding his water, because ultimately he's the decision maker. And so, when I look at like, that's another way to evaluate coaching, where you're looking at, like, for example, the last, Frank Reich during his time with the Colts added 1.17 wins above the average coach just by those things: fourth down decisions, 2-point conversion, and that's something where you're a general manager and the owner comes to you and says, hey, Thomas, we're 3-5 this year. And you can look and say, yeah, but we're doing all the right things. It's just a couple bad bounces. Like, there are tools now that you have to be able to say, hey, we're on the right track, keep going, right? Versus, hey, we're struggling right now. We gotta figure out something different fundamentally.
Well, and this is a lead into another topic, another time, because we'll be strong on this when there are truly coaching changes. But I am bullish on getting to a spot where these teams, when they're in the middle of their new their coaching search, there's other layers for our listeners to understand. Is, yes, it's about the head coach and how you pick that head coach. Also, very, very important how you're picking the coordinators. But what's overlooked at times, that's huge, don't get me wrong, is the next wave. When you start talking about position coaches, there are way too many sort of whimsical choices on putting together the entire staff versus, okay, I got my head coach, I got my two coordinators. It really doesn't matter. Anyone who's ever been a team builder, who has sat beside the owner and the president when they're and the new head coach, and you're trying to figure out your coaching staff, it is vital that you put the right staff together. You know why? We've talked about this a little bit. Many reasons. You're developing the players. There's so many things. Most of the position coaches are responsible for the substitutions. We've talked about that before. That is a big thing. There is a lot there. And if you just, as a head coach, if Jeff Saturday or Dan Campbell just goes out there and brings in players that he played in the NFL with because they were good guys and they were smart guys, there's a lot more to it than just your loyal myrmidons that are going to be on your side. You have to pick the right coaches. Where I believe statistical analysis can be doing wonderful things in the future in how you help put the entire staff together.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, think about this, like team success is a combination of usage of players, efficiency of players, and basically like hitting the right side of variance, right? And I think obviously usage of players, as you just said, that's assistant coaches. Efficiency is about how good your players are, and hitting on the right side of variance, that is where coaches, I think, add the most. And so you're looking at 3 inputs there, not just the one, and that's an important thing. So cool. We're at 56 minutes right now. Obviously, this has been a lot of fun. There's a lot of good energy here. We really thank the chat and the listeners. There's been a steady set of listeners here. We really appreciate you. We're going to read some questions here. By the way, for those of you that are not familiar, at SumerSports on Twitter, to follow, we're tweeting out cool stats and graphics that we're making as a part of what we're working on. Some of the stuff is walled off. Most of the stuff is walled off for the teams, but some of the stuff we're allowed to make a little bit public. At SumerSports on Twitter, if you're interested at all in that. And then obviously, please, if you like this podcast, please subscribe to the YouTube page at SumerSports on YouTube. The more the subscribers if you subscribe, you'll get notices every time Thomas and I make one of these podcasts. And also I cut up these podcasts and make smaller versions of it so that you can listen to those kind of 2-minute sound bites whenever you're going to the bathroom or you're sitting in line at a coffee shop or something. Those have been valuable as well. So okay. On SumerSports, I tweet out Monday. Does anybody have questions for the pod? We've gotten some good ones. I really like this because I'm a huge fan of offensive line coaches, and this is a great question. So this is from Sean Donahue. Does an elite position coach, so Scarnecchia comes to mind, does that play into player evaluation and acquisition strategy at all?
Great question, Donahoe, by the way. I would say this. I was with Dante Scarnecchia in New England. Just so everyone knows, Dante Scarnecchia, one of the very best O-line coaches in the history of our game. He was very involved, by the way. I didn't even know if you knew this, Eric. We put together this ideation pod at the beginning of kicking off SumerSports, and he was a very important part of our ideation pod per discussions about O-line. Was so happy to have him on board. Yes, as a general manager, if you have strong people at the position coaching spot and that they develop well, that they have a history of taking athletes and molding them, teaching them the right way, of course, right? We evaluate, by the way, all of those coaches, just like we would players. We would have our own metric tree for the coaches. It might be 15 metrics within that grading. And a guy like Dante Scarnecchia, he was off the charts on every level, whether it was leadership, whether it was scheme, whether it was technique, whether it was development, whether it was articulation of whatever, whether it was grading. Very, very important. So yes, very important. You, on the flip side, can have someone on your staff that is not big on developing youthful talent. That is a bear as a general manager. You might love the guy. You might sit down in the lunchroom and talk with him about the history of the league, and yet you're pulling your hair out because they are not developers of talent, nor do they care. If they had their ways, they would bring in the veteran guys. John Gruden, who was a great coach out there one time, it can be argued by many people, but really, really good football family and coach. That wasn't his shtick. He did not want to bring in the young guys to develop. Of course, he's not a position coach, but it's very, very important to make sure that you know your staff. That one of the very important things about a GM, brother, you need to not only know your personnel staff, you need to know your coaching staff, where the strengths are. It's a great question.
Yeah, because veterans are expensive.
Right.
Right. I mean, and like we think of like veteran minimum guys and all this kind of stuff, but veteran minimum guys are expensive too, because if they have a great year, they're going to want a contract extension. Whereas rookies, they're locked in for 3-4 years at their current price. There's value in knowing that your coach is one of the guys, is a developer versus somebody who's more of a, a veteran kind of guy. So it's extremely important. This is a question I think for both of us, but you with more of a traditional football background and me, it's like, what should be made? And this is from Luke Saihogos on Twitter. What should be made of the sudden uptick in rushing efficiency league-wide? I am working under the assumption that it is a combination of poor league-wide quarterback play, pass protection, but I also could see this just being variance. This is a great question. I think Tay Seth, former intern of mine, listener to the show as well, asked about the same thing. And this came in today, so maybe it's caught you a little off guard, Thomas. But like, we talk about the league not being stationary, right? What works back when Drew Brees, Phillip Rivers, Big Ben, Tom Brady, Aaron Rodgers, Patrick Mahomes, Alex Smith, all those good quarterbacks are in their prime. And Alex Smith was not belong in that group, but he's a good quarterback. All those quarterbacks are in their prime versus now where it's a bunch of young guys trying to figure it out, a bunch of old guys trying to hang on, and Patrick Mahomes.
Well, I'm curious. I not just because I didn't expect the question. I would love to hear your lead in from an analytics perspective, and then I'd love to riff on it, because it's another really good question. And we keep getting these great questions, and I'd love you to comment on Luke's comment first.
Yeah, so generally speaking, passing in the NFL is more efficient than running, and it's almost like, except for second and third and fourth and short. So second and 3 are shorter, third and 2 are shorter, fourth and 2 are shorter. Passing is more efficient than running across the board. Whether you look at yards per play, whether you look at expected points added, however you look at it, passing is more efficient than running. And so, the big thing, and the other thing is that play action efficiency does not depend on the running game in any meaningful way, meaning the whole idea of establishing the run has been proven to be somewhat of a myth, meaning you don't have to run the ball 7 times for play action to work. It just works. And you look at the tracking data and stuff, linebackers move, and it's weird, right? And, as a tight end in my career, like, I liked running the football. No one liked pass protecting. No one liked, we all liked running the ball. So there's always, I think always pushback against analytics, because analytics usually is like, look, you should run less. Mm-hmm. Now, running this season hasn't been more efficient than passing, but it's been more efficient than it usually is. And I think part of that reason is because teams on defense, and you look at the Fangio tree, so you look at Staley, Staley's assistant Raheem Morris, Joe Barry in Green Bay, they're playing a lot more too high, which means a lot more of pressure on interior defensive linemen and linebackers to make stops themselves, as opposed to like the safety coming into the box. You're Rodney Harrison when you were in New England type of thing. Like, those guys are playing deeper. And so there has been an uptick in efficiency running the football this year. The question is that fundamental? Is that a real change in the league, a really response to what we're seeing? Or is that just like a one-year blip on the radar screen?
One of the things I was thinking about, we went up and down, of course, as building the Atlanta Falcons over all those years. I mean, starting with Matt Ryan back in 2008, bringing in Tony Gonzalez, bringing in Julio Jones, continuing to bring in Calvin Ridley and other, we continued to grow more and more on the athleticism side and the let's go deep, let's rip it off the top so we can do things underneath. We never, 16, we Devontae Freeman, I mean, we did some good things. We were never known, but for those early years with Michael Turner, we were, right? Michael Turner rocked it for us for 4 years in those first few years. And we had a tone about us and a toughness about us under Mike Smith that was set because of the running element. Believe me, I love running. I wish that we were a better running team. I may still be there if we were a better running team towards the back end of the years. And I look at what Arthur Smith is doing with the Falcons right now and his O-line coach and how they're getting by with players that are solid players, but they're journeyman running backs, right? They're running their butts off and they're setting a tone, not only setting the tone from running, but all of a sudden you become looked at as a lot more of a resilient, tough ass team that teams know going into, like, we're going to have our world cut out for us here, versus you unfortunately are perceived as a much more finesse team if you're ripping it off the top with the passing game and putting the run game on the side. We unfortunately were not consistent with our run game over the years.
Yeah, and I think it's obviously better to be a good running team than not a good running team. Like, that's clear. I think that the run to me is always something where if you can do it in a way that is unpredictable, it's almost always better than not being able to do it. And I marvel at a team like Tennessee where everybody knows they're going to run the football, and for the most part they can have success. I think for most offenses, you have to be a team for which the run is a surprise. And I think, the hard part is like, our football sensibilities from when we're young, the best player on all of our teams is the running back. And then we get to our age and the best player on the team is now the quarterback or wide receiver. And it sort of doesn't jive with our sense of what wins. And so, like, I think that, and like, that's why, by the way, they had the XFL draft today. And I love the USFL and the CFL and the XFL, because there's a little bit more of like the running game matters because the quarterbacks aren't quite as good. And I think, to answer the question broadly, I think this season it's mostly because the quarterback play is down, but it's down in large part because the teams are playing those too high looks. And so that to me is more fundamental. Let's answer one. Frazier, you've been an MVP. You've asked so many questions today. Let's answer one more. I think, are there any coaches in the league that either of you would like to see get head coaching jobs, either first time or second? I've had one that I've watched coach that I always thought got a bad break, and I think he will get a head coach job here soon. And I think he deserves it. And that's Shane Steichen, the offensive coordinator of the Eagles. I thought he did a really good job with Justin Herbert as a rookie, and got fired because they didn't win, right? And Anthony Lynn's staff got fired, and now he's doing a great job with Jalen Hurts. Like, I think he's going to be a person who is a good head coach in the NFL. And I said this on Twitter, like, I've said this for like a year, so everybody knows my opinion there. But I think he's very good.
So it's interesting being around a lot of staffs, right? There have been some really good football coaches. As a general manager, you're really critical about which one of those guys would take over if the head coach were to have been fired or something health related happened. Who would step in? And no disrespect to anyone, it's a really narrow funnel, right? Because you ultimately have to be the one telling the owner, this is the dude to take us to the next level if our guy goes down. That said, I can talk about assistants. I do want to say Raheem Morris, I am fascinated by where he is in the league now. And Raheem, he did what he did in Tampa. He has so much energy and he's a really, really smart guy. I want to see if he has learned everything that I believe he has learned to get another opportunity to be at the helm, because he is a really good football man. He's just got to take everything that he learned and understand that life in the NFL has changed, and it's changing quickly.
Yeah, I mean, you hit on my thing, which was Raheem Morris took everything that Brandon Staley did with that defense in 2020 and supercharged it. And I really feel like that Super Bowl that they won against the Bengals was really his day in the sun. Like, I thought he did the disguising coverages, the stunts, all that stuff. And he had good talent there, don't get me wrong. But there's also Darius Williams, a low draft capital guy. There's, he turned John Johnson into a good player. Like, Ernest Jones is a linebacker who no one really cared about that had a great Super Bowl. And I thought that he did a good job there. So let's get the last one. Benjamin Robinson, who gave us a great question last week. I did prep you for this because this was my old podcast. We had what were called recommendations, where George and I would talk about, like, podcasts we liked or food we liked or whatever. Ben Robinson asked, in all of your travels this year, what's the best meal you've had, Thomas? I'm going to let you take the floor here for a second.
Oh, wow. I was in Paris, believe it or not. And I've never, as I mentioned, traveled in the fall. I was on my honeymoon, and we ate at a restaurant right in the middle of Paris. And it was one of those meals that was just the most decadent fish with the most decadent scallop meal. It was really pescatarian friendly, which is how I like to eat. But that said, in the very end, I've moved on from my desserts very quickly. They had this literally, it was a cigar, but it was an ice cream cigar wrapped in some unbelievable pastry. Leave it to the French, right, to make this amazing pastry. And so it was the best meal I probably ever had this year.
Gotcha. Yeah, it's crazy. I've traveled so much this year, and I honestly, it sounds like a cop out, but I'm going to talk about the last place I literally went, which was BYU. My friend Matt Edwards, who runs football for StatsBomb, the grandson of Lavelle Edwards, he gave me 3 recommendations, and they went 3 for 3, including Lavelle Edwards' favorite Mexican restaurant. But I'm going to go with the last one he gave me, which was Communal. The reason I like Communal, and this might offend, people who don't drink or what, people, who go to Utah and don't want to drink, but I wanted to have a drink. So I went to the Communal and I had steak fried, like I had a steak there that was to die for, but I also had 2 really like amazing drinks. It was also like I was watching that Falcons Panthers game on my phone. It was just, and I was reading a book. It was like super peaceful. And it was just kind of, and I'm an easy guy. Most people know me. I'll eat whatever. But that was one where I was like, oh, this hit the spot. And it was fun because, when I was in Utah, it was hard to find drinks. Right. So then I went there and had one and it was very good.
Great.
So, awesome. Well, this was fun. From the bottom of my heart, thank you all for coming and hanging out with us. We went a little long, but I think, no one's going to, no one's going to fault us for that. It was such good conversation with so many good topics. And honestly, Thomas, like we didn't get to like half the stuff on the page, which means next week's going to be even better. So for Thomas Dimitrov, this has been Eric Eager. This has been episode 7 of the SumerSports Show. Thank you all for coming.